800-597-9323. Call right now. 800-597-9323.
Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month based on what you can afford to pay. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395.
You're listening to Joco Community Radio.
Well, good afternoon, Johnson County. Welcome back to Let Freedom Ring. I am your host, Jake Wernette. We want to thank you for tuning back in on this beautiful, it's Tuesday, isn't it, Sean?
I believe so.
So, welcome back on this gorgeous Tuesday.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, boss. I want to thank y'all for tuning in. We have some beautiful weather today. A bit of a different topic today. First, we want to give out some local tips on what our future episodes are going to be like coming up in the next few days. So one thing that we are going to be discussing here in the next coming 2 weeks, we have an episode that we're going to be doing on eminent domain. So one thing that we're going to be discussing, there is an older lady from what tips I've gotten in that is losing her house, and her neighbors are losing their land to either a public interest that is being brought in, a corporation to set up a facility there. We're going to be getting the full scoop next week. We're going to be trying to bring her on to the show discussing eminent domain. Why is it happening? Is it beneficial to especially small towns in Texas like Burleson, Cleburne that are growing? We know that these growing cities desperately need land for a growing population. They need land for public, essential public use facilities like water management, water refining facilities. We desperately need more land that is being used and managed well in this state. And especially with the water crisis going on, many cities are being short of water that they're going to be needing projected here for future population growth. It's something essential that we need to discuss on here. So we're having her come in. We're going to be discussing some world politics here coming up. We're going to have Stephen Swain coming back on to discuss the economic growth.
Well, hopefully. Maybe he calls in, maybe he doesn't.
The geopolitics of China and Russia and how that is going to impact the United States coming up. There's been a lot of talk about world wars coming back when we have Iran giving $4 billion in money to Hamas and other terror groups, terror cells in the Middle East, especially $4 billion that our own president had sent over there to Iran.
So it's our $4 billion, American USD.
We are seeing our government being the middleman for laundering money to terror groups.
Isn't that like a James Bond movie plot?
There was one that they had a terror group. Was it the Spectre had the nuclear device?
No, it was Casino Royale. Bond lost a poker game and the government funded terrorism against themselves.
Yeah.
That's where we're on now. We're on like the James Bond movie plot, and the rest of us having to live through it.
So we've got a lot of topics coming up that we're going to discuss. Another thing we're going to be discussing is the history of the Chinese military. I think that's something interesting that not a lot of people get insight into. Matter of fact, I started a new book. It's by Eric Derschmeid. It's called The Military History of China from 1218 to the Present Day. It's only about 324 pages. I'm about a third of the way through myself. Very interesting stuff. Not many people will know that China actually had a large ocean-going navy 100 years before Christopher Columbus ever set voyage to the New World. And it was these long boats, these flagships that were, I believe it said 3 times longer and 4 times larger than the biggest military frigate in the Spanish galleon at the
That's
time.
not something to go off of. The Chinese have never been a true naval power because of their geography, their terrain.
Yeah.
The few ships they have built, yeah, they've been impressive, but they've never done much with them. And look at the Chinese Navy, the one they're trying to build now, these submarine fleets.
Yeah.
These things are sinking on their own.
It's very interesting. We look at the way that Europe and the way that the Orient has always interacted with one another. It's never been really on good terms, especially with the Opium Wars. You had the British who tried to go over there and open it up. You had Admiral Nelson with the United States that tried to go open China up, and that's one thing that has still impacted the way that we interfere and involve ourselves with one another. Today's episode is going to be on a similar page. We're going to be discussing the geography of the Big Three. So, for anybody who doesn't know what the Big Three is, there are three superpowers in the world today, classified superpowers. That is open to interpretation, whether somebody wants to include three superpowers or we're still going off of the Cold War rhetoric of whoever's got the most money and can spend the most without bankrupting themselves is a superpower. But militarily speaking, geographically speaking, there are three countries right now that are the top three largest in the world. And the United States, the premier superpower that has been for almost 100 years now, is in that category. The Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, is a second one. And we're looking at the Communist People's Republic of China is gauging themselves to be the third. Whether they are going to be effective enough at maintaining that hierarchical structure, or they are merely going to collapse from the current debt crisis that's going on over there, the housing
The debt is the least of their issues, but we'll get into that.
the housing bubble. They've got a lot of factors, a very mismanaged government that is leading to us reconsidering essentially how our financial market is going to work with China. People say that the United States is overspending, their debt spending. The Chinese have a debt problem as well.
It's what I think it's 10 times ours. There's not enough capital in the world to sustain China.
The ratio is much larger than ours. Even though, the United States has $33 trillion in debt, what we're seeing is China's per capita ratio is much higher than the United States, especially in the real estate mortgage market.
Oh yeah, these fake houses they're building.
Yeah, and these ghost cities that are going up too.
Want to jump into Russian geography?
So we've got a few maps here that we're just going to be discussing. For those who aren't able to see them, we're going to kind of go through and briefly, just if when you get the chance to look at a map, you get the chance to go back and look. We're going from the Shepherd Historical Atlas, which has probably been the premier atlas in the United States since 1956. One of the atlases to beat. One of them that's very rare to find anymore too. We're going to be discussing, essentially, we're going to be going down the list here, looking through a few maps and discussing. There are two factors we want everybody to consider while we're going over this. Number one, we want you to consider with us the geographical advantage that the United States has that no other country in the world has. The second is we're going to be discussing how culture plays into this, how the geography of the United States, of the Russian Federation, of Communist China, how it interferes with the mindset. A lot of times people say you are what you eat, but the truth of the matter is you are where you are. And that sounds confusing, but culture a lot of times is derived from the landscape that we grow up, the jobs that landscape provides, the resources that it creates for the American population. A person's mindset in New York City is going to be very different from a person's mindset in rural Kentucky, and a person's mindset and their culture in rural Kentucky is very different from the very rural area of a Russian in Siberia. The resources are also very different. The Russians might have a lot of timber in rural Siberia that they are harvesting for paper, for building houses. They might rely heavily on timber, whereas a person in Texas might be deriving their economic sustainment from oil exports, natural gas, and especially Gulf Coast fishing. So all of these things taken into account are what play into a broader factor than what we often consider politics as. Geopolitics, Karl Haushofer, many people forget the name. He was actually the mentor of Adolf Hitler, one of the greatest tyrants in history. Karl Haushofer is not a household name,
The
but
demon of geopolitics.
he's brought up as the demon of geopolitics. He is actually the gentleman who had given Hitler most of his ideas about Lebensraum, about expansion of Nazi Germany. And you look at the ethnic groups, you look at the culture, you look at the landscape of Europe. Karl Haushofer was essentially the gentleman who had given Hitler his most evil ideas of ethnic cleansing, of geopolitics, of the advantage that Germany had in Central Europe, making it one of the, if not the, still the most industrial power
Well, that's
across
changing with
Europe.
deindustrialization, but that's a whole
Yeah.
other episode. So let's jump in with Russia, because this is going to be a long one. Russia has horrible geography. Most of what we consider Russia, where the people live, where the industry is at, where the food is grown,
Yeah.
is all on the European western side. The rest is tundra and permafrost.
Yeah.
And Russia has lots of resources, natural gas, metals, chromium, all of it, right? Most of it is frozen under permafrost, and you just can't really get to it. And they also have a lack of river systems. They have the Volga and whatnot, but that river system doesn't leave Central Asia.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to get from one end of Russia to the other. Even in the modern world, there's only a few rails that do that. The Vladivostok, which is a very far eastern city in Asia for Russia, is almost completely cut off from the rest of the country. And there's really nothing in between but a myriad of villages and tundras.
Yeah.
This is extremely unfortunate for them on the global stage, because it really means they're only playing with half a deck of cards compared to us.
The essential fact of the matter too is Russia is not tied into any sort of open sea trade route either.
Yeah, so they have the Baltic and they have the Black Sea.
Russia, when we look at a map of Russia, and I'm just going to pull one up here real quick for my own reference. If you have one, take a look as well. When we look at a map of Russia just in general, Russia really has access through the Black Sea. The Caspian Sea is kind of closed off, a landlocked sea.
Well, and don't forget the Baltic.
The Baltic Sea. The point of the matter is their real only direct route to the ocean is through the Arctic and down across the Sea of Japan or the Bering Sea.
Yeah.
So
that's been horrible for them, by the way. They've had a horrible history with the Japanese. So
Yeah.
really, we're talking about the Western Baltic and Black Sea. To those who are familiar with history, the war in the Ukraine right now, it's really over warm water ports like the Black Sea,
Yeah.
which the Ukraine has a large chunk of. That's really what's going on here. Russia is trying to secure an economic future by securing those ports entirely. And this happens repeatedly throughout history. And the Baltic is the only viable part of the year. So
Yeah.
they need the Black Sea to survive.
And that kind of played into the whole taking of the Crimean Peninsula as
Yeah.
well.
Absolutely.
Back especially in 2014, 2015, when the Crimean War was going on. And, we're not going to mention
That wasn't the Crimean War. That was Crimean War was in the 1860s, 1870s.
the Peninsula War for it.
No, Russia walked into Crimea completely unopposed in 2014. The Ukrainians gave it up, and the Crimeans considered themselves ethnic Russians. That's a whole another discussion.
We're not going to mention the illegitimate regime change that the United States had pulled in Ukraine. That being out of the question entirely, what we see and focusing back on the map is when Russia wants access to the Atlantic. When Russia has access to the Atlantic, they have access to the rest of the intelligence that they can have on the American military.
No, they don't care about that.
Outside of
that, it's not about that at all. It's
well,
about trade.
they're looking for relationships in the Western Hemisphere.
Relationships, yes, but they don't care about the military intelligence. This is about trade and relationships for ideas. This goes back to Peter the Great. He came to the West. He was an emperor of Russia, and he was called Peter the Great because he reformed Russia entirely and started dragging it into the modern world little by little. He went to the West, Germany, I believe, and he brought back shipbuilding methods, military tactics, engineering methods, all of these things. And since then, he's always had this focus, and Russia has had this focus on the Baltic, securing the Baltic. And the Crimean War, same thing, secure the Black Sea so you can have access to the Mediterranean, the Atlantic beyond that.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is we classify empires not only for the land that they have, but the land that they can control outside of their grasp. Not necessarily invasion, but puppet states.
Belarus.
The Soviet Union had set up across the Iron Curtain in the 40s and 50s. The control through proxy wars in the 60s and 70s in Asia, the regime changes in Kazakhstan. What we're seeing now is Russia sending in troops into Kazakhstan to put down rebellions. They're doing the same thing.
That happened a year ago, and they were successful. Now,
Yeah.
Kazakhstan is essentially a Russian puppet.
I infer if Russia is going to not necessarily just survive, but thrive, if they have any chance at competition, what's going to happen is they're going to be doing the same thing that we see communist China doing in Africa. China is investing heavily in building railway networks, building infrastructure projects, financing them on Chinese loans that they know Africa is never going to pay back.
Russia is staying out of Africa with the exception of the PMC group Wagner.
Yeah.
Russia doesn't have the capital to spare right now because of the Ukrainian war. And we really need to discuss how the terrain you were talking about shapes the mindset here of the Russians. Russians, fierce, independent, proud. Why? Well, the real Russian mindset goes back to the Mongol yoke.
Yeah.
The Russians were the only reason the Mongols weren't really able to get into Western Europe. The Russians bled the Mongols so much that by the time the Russians finally fell to the Mongols tried to break into Central and Western Europe, they just didn't have it anymore. The Russian people stopped the Mongol blitzkrieg, if you would, that steppe fury. They survived under the Mongol yoke barely, then the yoke collapsed. The Mongol Empire collapsed.
Yeah.
And the Russians took over all that old territory stretching all the way to the Pacific. Mongolia was actually under the Russian Empire for many years.
What we see, especially we go back to the naval warfare of Russia.
It's a horrible record.
The Black Sea is the only apparatus going through the canal zone with Turkey,
The Bosphorus?
the Bosphorus
Yeah, the
Strait.
Bosphorus.
That's their real only access to
Warm water.
ports, especially in the Mediterranean, North Africa. And then this whole section, anytime that they have to go through the Baltic or they go through the Black Sea, they're always passing allies to the United States. And that's something that Russia has struggled with for a century now almost.
Oh, try 1,000 years.
The onslaught of continuing to have to go by American-backed intelligence, they have to go through north of Germany through the
before us, they had the exact same issues with the Swedish Empire in the Baltic and the Black Sea, the Turkic or the Ottoman Empire. The German Empire hurt them in the Baltic. The British harassed them constantly in Japan in the East. We're the new boogeyman, essentially. But Russia's had this same fight with all these powers over the Baltic and the Black Sea this entire time. That you see the same conflict over and over again in history. It's like this 150-year gap in between them.
Essentially, what we see is the Russians are either investing in ice-breaking technology to go through the Arctic. They have a new nuclear-powered icebreaker that they had just put out. I believe it was about 5-6 years ago, and they've been testing it in the Arctic Sea. The Russians, we're going to continue. I think we're going to continue to see a struggle between the United States and Russia, especially for access to the Atlantic.
Absolutely.
Now, when we discuss puppet states too, Sean, I don't mean that Russia's going to be over here interfering with the United States. They could give two craps about the United States. The Russians have been playing a steady game of cat and mouse, waiting for the United States to get into these forever wars, bankrupting.
Yeah.
Russia's going to survive that if they can play their cards right.
This Ukraine thing it's very controversial, but I think I'm accurate here. The Russians are playing us.
They want us to
Russia is taking and chewing up the Western military industrial might right now. And yeah, they're suffering casualties, don't get me wrong.
But they've sent
Yeah.
enough people in there to keep it going, to at least keep up the appearance of a large
The
war
West will
effort.
run out of money and bullets for the Russians run out of manpower.
Yeah.
Which that's a whole nother thing. Let me address this too. All of Russia's rivers flow north.
Yeah.
If I was in Russia, where would the last place I'd want to go further?
North.
Yeah, right. And on that note, that makes creating and transporting capital in Russia horrible.
Yeah.
That's not helping them at all.
Especially the railroad lines that go through Siberia
Yeah.
as well.
There's only a few in their horrible condition. I would not want to be
iced over half the year at the least. But Russia, I think what we're going to see, Sean, I don't know how well you are going to differ on this with me. Russia and BRICS have been growing closer. I think what we're going to see is another move, kind of like we saw in the Cold War with Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. We saw this with people recently in Venezuela. The move from South America, we see South America and Latin America kind of going more towards Russia again. And we see China is kind of playing the fiddle in Africa, and Russia is kind of moving back into Latin America.
Cold War.
We're in a second Cold War,
Yeah.
I would argue.
Although it's not communism versus capitalism, it's just one empire
Yeah.
against another.
Now, I'm not saying that the Russians are going to force their way and invade over into South America, but what we could see here in the future is if Russia has enough gumption to take the rest of the coast, which is what we saw. They primarily stuck to the coast in southeast Ukraine, close to their bases in Crimea. And I'm going to ask you your opinion on this. In my opinion, I think what we're going to see, the power struggle is going to be for Russia to get access to warm water ports and
They have it now.
An ensured state of affairs in the Mediterranean so that they can access and quite possibly move at least one joint naval base over to somewhere like Venezuela, where Russia is giving them a bigger economic support in return for getting at least a small naval base that can hold one ship.
So this whole BRICS thing, BRICS isn't real. And I used to be kind of worried about BRICS as well. It's not real. BRICS is mostly developing nations clinging to Russia and China, which are dying nations. And it's moving money from Western pockets to Eastern pockets, particularly China, through the Green Movement.
Yeah.
It's completely useless. And this is something we have to keep in mind in Russia. Russia will probably outlast us, but they're not going to defeat us.
Yeah.
Russia's demographics are absolutely horrible. That country, as we know it, will not exist. They are doing what they're doing in the Ukraine because they're never going to have this kind of manpower available again in the near future. So they're using it to secure territory so they can feel safe after they lose these demographics. As they're losing young men, there's going to be no young men in the future, Russia, or young women, because of the demographic collapse. So they're trying to secure what they have now.
At the decline of the Russian population, you mentioned a good point there, Sean. We look at, I'm going to try and trace this back to one event and see if we can debate on whether we can agree on this or not. I think what really stumped Russia was Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's move to try and invade Moscow in the east, the Eastern Front for Nazi Germany. What we see is the Americans focused on one place, that it was invading through Normandy, through Saint-Lô, and going right into Paris, moving all the way
whereas Russia
east towards Berlin.
Russia was fighting a continental war for several years on their own, essentially. No help.
I believe they sent up to 4 million soldiers to fight Barbarossa in Leningrad, Stalingrad.
More, because you have the partisan militias.
Yeah.
Russia lost, I think it was like 20% of their population in the war. And this is why the Russians are so paranoid, why they don't like people in their business now. Imagine America's entire East Coast died and was set on fire.
Yeah.
Just magically. Or let's say magically, right? We would be very paranoid about anything getting close to the East Coast after that. Understandably so. That's the Russians.
And that was the whole logic between Stalin's paranoia with the Iron Curtain too.
The Reich destroyed Western Russia. Keep in mind, everything valuable in Russia is where? The West.
Yeah.
Western Russia. All that was destroyed. and there was mass famines, and the Russians had to sacrifice everything to win that war just to survive.
Yeah.
We were trying to beat Germany because we had a different ideology, and America had been bombed by their ally.
Yeah.
Russia was fighting Germany because if they lost, they would have been exterminated in the Holocaust because they weren't ethnic Germans. Very different kind of war. The Eastern Front has been dubbed the worst part of that war and one of the worst fronts in the 20th century.
And that through the 1950s, we look at the 40s to the 50s, between 1940 and roughly about 1969, less than 20 years, the American population almost doubled.
Can I want to say a few more things in the Russia.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left before we got to move on to China and America. Thank God, America. The Russians sacrificed so much. They didn't have all the industrial base we had at first in that war, and they were invaded by surprise by Germans because Germany and Russia had a treaty at the time.
Yeah.
Completely by surprise, they were invaded. The Russian men were throwing themselves in the thousands, or really in the millions, to try to just slow the Germans, not even just beat them, just to slow them down so their women and children could escape further east into Eurasia.
Yeah.
At the Battle of the Volga, the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad has been named the bloodiest battle in human history. Millions died for that city alone. That's not looking at the siege of Leningrad, the siege of Moscow. It was a horrible war for them, and they don't call it World War II. They call it the Great Patriotic War. The Great Patriotic War. Because they were, like I said before, they were fighting to survive. They were going to be exterminated if they lost that war.
Yeah.
We were just fighting for the flag and for our own freedom because we'd been bombed by Germany's ally, Japan. Britain was fighting to stay out of the Reich. Russia was fighting to survive. And that very much shaped the Russian mentality going forward because they are extremely paranoid of any outsider now. I would be too, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
There's a tradition in Russia. They have boxes of red stars because every Soviet soldier was given a red star.
Yeah.
It's like their dog tag, I guess, because you have no name in the Soviet Union. You're just the star, right? You belong to the state.
Yeah.
They have boxes upon boxes of red stars. Every family. Imagine every family in America having 30 sets of dog tags.
Jeez.
That's what Russia went through in World War II.
And that I would trace that back as what really set the Russians behind in terms of population.
Yes, absolutely. They have not recovered, so they still have many more women than men.
Yeah.
I think for every one Russian man, there's 5 Russian women. I might be going to Russia soon.
So join us the second half. We discussed Russian geopolitics. We're going to be discussing China and the United States next. Who is going to outlive who? What resources and what plays into the culture of the politics behind these countries? Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Let's be honest. Wheelchairs are heavy, bulky, and ugly. If you carry a wheelchair in your car to take care of a loved one, you know how hard it is getting that clunky, old-style wheelchair in and out of your car. Introducing the Feather Chair Wheelchair. At 13 pounds, it's the world's lightest wheelchair. It folds in seconds and fits neatly in your trunk, backseat, or closet, so you can take it everywhere. And it's only available right here. Order yours today and get a free wheelchair case, a $50 value, yours free. The Feather Chair. The world's lightest wheelchair is just $4.99 with easy payments as low as $16 a month. Sorry, no Medicare or insurance accepted. So call right now to order yours.
800-823-5826. 800-823-5826. 800-823-5826. That's 800-823-5826.
Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month based on what you can afford to pay. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month based on what you can afford to pay. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395.
You're listening to Joco Community Radio.
Welcome back, Johnson County, to the second half of today's broadcast. Let Freedom Ring. I'm your host, Jake Wernette. We're waiting on Sean to get back from the water fountain. We'll let Benny Goodman and his orchestra finish up on this real quick. Thank you, sir. First, we'd like to say Joco Community Radio is proud to be the voice of Johnson County, Texas, and is live 24/7 on the TuneIn Radio Network. TuneInJoco.com is the place to find all the best ways to listen and watch. The station app, which I highly recommend, is also available for free on both Android and Apple devices. Simply search your store, check out our lineup and more at JocoCommunityRadio.com. This episode and more are brought to you by Next Level Claims, making your insurance work for you. Reach out to your local Texas sales rep at 844-839-4245. That's 844-839-4245. Today's episode, we're discussing the geopolitics of the United States, the Russian Federation, and Communist China. Today's episode is essentially us trying to figure out what makes countries think the way that they do, what makes politics the way it is, and what has created the system of international relations that we have seen in the last few generations since the Cold War and World War II.
Can I go into the Chinese mindset? Then let you talk about the hovering debt bomb China has.
Yeah, so the next segment that we're going to get into here is going to be discussing China and the United States. The last one, we kind of spent a while discussing the Russian Federation. So China is the world's second largest population. We'll get that right out of the way. I believe they have about 1.4 billion people now. They're not quite on track to the 1.5 billion that India has. These nations, too, are the developing and the developed are having severe population declines. What we're noticing is they're below replenishment rate. A lot of times it takes government policy to play into this. The United States does not incentivize families anymore. Nations like Hungary and Eastern Europe are actually giving out tax incentives. They're saying if you have over, I believe it's 5 kids now, if you have over 5 kids, 4 or 5 kids, then you don't have to pay income tax the rest of your life. What we see is the Western governments like the United States really don't take an incentive on families anymore. And I can credit that, like I have said many times in other broadcasts on this program, that I don't think the United States values or has any virtue for life anymore. That kind of plays down to the slippery slope, one could say, but I really do believe that if we are a nation that is going to tolerate abortion, then the next logical step after that is if we're not valuing a life in the womb, then we're not going to value a life that is outside the womb. So after that comes legalized euthanasia. And then ultimately the purge. Like many of those movies, you're going to start seeing people running around and killing each other like they are in Chicago, the hellholes that Seattle and all of these major cities have become. The murder rate in New York alone, I believe, tops out the entire nation of Canada. So we see these nations not valuing life. One of the programs in China that played into this and the debt crisis that's going on now is not having enough people to pay off the debt, not enough people to buy these houses, not enough to bring down mortgages because of healthy competition. That has played into nothing more than the communist mindset, the one-child policy, most of which were men. They had a massive abortion program in China for female babies because they didn't see female babies.
It's more horrible than abortion. Abortion kills them while they're in the womb, which is pretty bad. The one-child policy was, oh, hey, if you have a second, third kid, we're going to throw them in a well as soon as they're born. Just a newborn baby.
It's kind of like the Romans did with the weak men.
No,
the weaker babies that were born.
No, that was the Spartans, not the Romans.
Yeah. So
ancient Greece.
the programs that were going on in China really play into their declining population. I don't mean that these people don't have a lot of people. They have 1.5 billion people almost.
China will lose
But
half of that going into the 2030s.
the majority of their population pyramid is starting to look like the United States. We're having most of our elders kind of broaden at the top. The pyramid is upside down. And that is the shift that we're seeing. For America, it plays into our trouble of paying off Social Security debts, entitlements that really didn't exist until the 1930s with the Roosevelt administration. In China, they might not have as big a social entitlement programs. But what we're seeing is those younger children are having to take care of their elders with modernization in China. We're seeing a population pyramid that is doomed to collapse, at least half the
So,
population.
You have to dig into the Chinese mindset first.
Yeah.
Kind of like we did with the Russian mindset. China, same thing, ancient and proud. They're one of the, I think, longest continuing civilization in the world.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pride that stems from that.
The Chinese have a very heritage mindset as well.
Yeah.
You look at
Well, Confucianism is all about honoring the elders. And,
Yeah.
and you can get more into that. I'm trying to glance over this because we don't have 2 hours or 4 episodes going to China alone.
yeah,
But you have Confucianism, which is very different than the way we think about things. There's also the point of the Chinese don't have the 10 Commandments. The Russians have the 10 Commandments. Europe and America have the 10 Commandments. This is a huge difference. The Chinese don't have the same right and wrong we do.
yeah,
That's why we get screwed over so often in dealings with them. They're coming from a completely different place. And I want to have Stephen Swain on to talk about this again because he spent years doing financial work in China.
yeah.
He can tell us all about it.
He's a brilliant man when
Yeah.
it comes to insight into how the Chinese do business.
West Pointer and Harvard educated. Very smart. There's also this other thing you have to realize with the Chinese. They're extremely collective and authoritarian.
They're
They have to
a
be.
very conquering race as well. When you
No,
look at the Han dynasty,
Their
the
Ming
Ming dynasty.
conquest only extends within their own borders.
Well, the Ming dynasty had actually tried to go overseas. They didn't have any overseas ports, but they had sent their what they called the Dragon Fleet overseas under Admiral Chung Ho and tried to. They got as far as the Cape of the Horn of Africa, and that actually stopped in Yemen. They stopped in
They
Saudi
didn't
Arabia.
conquer that though. The
No,
Chinese
but
are best
they
at killing Chinese.
they had actually invested heavily early on in seeing if they could hypothetically conquer overseas territories.
They had trades. They had trading city states. That was it.
The
Vassals.
But given that was the hypothetical future for them, they wanted a world, even if they didn't invade the mass world at large, some place that they could have naval ports to control their trade routes.
Yeah.
That was what was
Well, I mean-
desired. Just like the Silk Road, you had the Silk Road that went through the Middle East that was controlled majorly by what we would call, I'm not sure the proper term, but mafia groups that would tax the exports that would go across the Silk Road in these different principalities. You had the groups in Europe that would be raided by certain groups to take advantage of the trade along the Silk Road. And we're seeing that kind of play into the infrastructure in Africa that the Chinese are
The
financing.
Chinese are creating debt bombs in Africa that'll blow up on them as well.
Yeah.
Back to the Chinese mindset, though, they're ancient, proud, they're very collective, very authoritarian. The Chinese have a geography problem.
Yeah.
Their coastline doesn't really allow for what we would consider a strong naval presence. This is why Japan has been able to bully China for so long. The Japanese, perfect conditions, perfect geography for a strong naval maritime force.
Yeah.
China, not so much.
That plays into why they're
China was not
coming
able-
out with
yeah.
conflict in the South China Sea.
Yeah, absolutely. China was not able to build real ports until the industrial era. They didn't have the tools and the resources to pull together to get those created until recently. In fact,
Yeah.
China was in a technologically stagnant state until the West started giving them stuff. That's
Yeah.
why they're always so eager to steal our technology from us. They can't develop their own. They're technologically stagnant. And you can thank the Mongols for that mostly, but they're still in that. The Russians have just started to move past from that.
I think it's a lot of times the Chinese have held against us the culture that we tried to bring over there. When we talk about the opening China, many people think of Richard Nixon initially. It was the British that had desired a lot of mineral exports, a lot of industrial exports of resources from the Chinese.
They wanted silk and tea.
yeah,
I still want silk and
to
tea.
Britain. And when China had refused to give it to them because they said, we've got two different cultures, two different ways of doing things,
Mhm.
the Chinese didn't want to open up to the rest of the world because they felt like their culture was going to be expatriated away from the masses.
And the West cracked them wide open.
What we saw was Britain had come in with the naval fleet and sent in opium.
And that led to the Boxer Rebellion in
Yeah.
1899, I believe.
And the U.S. Marines had a part in going over to try and
Yeah.
put down the Boxer Rebellion.
It was like 100 Marines, German Marines. The British Army was there.
Yeah.
A variety of Western navies.
I think a lot of that
Um,
mixed with the mindset that the Chinese have, the business mindset, wanting to get ahead, taking advantage, that really plays into them hold. I believe that they still hold the Boxer Rebellion. They still hold the Opium Wars against the West still.
you have, so here's the thing. The Chinese are coming from greatness. They really are.
Yeah.
They don't really have that anymore. Even what they have now, it's not going to last. And I would be pretty bitter about that, wouldn't you?
I think the Chinese are struggling.
And keep in mind, you know what they call that century? The century of shame.
Yeah.
That's what they're trying. That's why they're putting on this big macho thing right now. They're trying to make up for the century of shame. I need to touch on the Yellow River real quick because we got to move on from China. I'm going to touch on the Yellow River and their demographic collapse. Then we got to move on to America. Thank God, it's almost time for America. The Yellow River is really the best river system the Chinese have, and it's nothing compared to what we have here at the Mississippi.
Yeah.
That, once again, just like Russia, makes it very hard to transport and create capital, which is critical for a modern country. And then their demographics. China is set to lose most of its people. China, as we know it today, will not exist soon. They're going to split up back into their warlord states, and they will not be an issue. That's why China doesn't really concern me. I think it's one of the biggest reasons American companies and investors are getting out of China. They've seen the numbers. They know what's coming.
The Chinese, we look at the mentality of it, the old warlord states that they once had under the dynasties. The principalities were governed themselves by ruling families, by governing elite families.
The dynastic system.
Yeah. What we see, even China had been governed, I believe, by 3 different dynasties at some point. It was 3 different. You had the Han, the Ming, and the third one.
The Han was their golden age.
Yeah.
And they lost that. They're trying to get back to that.
What we have seen, I believe, is China's struggle for understanding that they've kind of lost themselves along the way, but they've also gained sort of a new breath. They're at a crossroads. They don't want to really lose their sense of identity and their own compass to the West, but they also want to be able to take part in a global system that reinforces a modernized economy. They know that they can't succeed with the old system necessarily. As much as I hate globalism, they understand that they have to play a part in their own hemisphere.
China loves globalism.
Yeah.
China is completely dependent upon imports. And they're hoping to God they can send enough exports to bring more imports in. Because China imports a large amount of fuel and food through these Straits of Malacca. That's their biggest weakness. If we really wanted to cripple China, and this comes from Stephen Swain, he said this on the show last time he was on.
Yeah.
Just put the Navy there. They'd starve out in a few months, the entire country. We got to move on to America. Do you want to talk about Manifest Destiny?
I can take the helm at that. I just want to finish one thing. I think what we're noticing is going to segue into the United States. What we've noticed, and looking at it from this perspective, the traditionalist versus progressive movement in China, the communist government really wants to progress. They want to be able to keep up with the West. They want to be able to reinforce their state, their
like the
global stage, just like the Soviet Union did. And the United States, when we think about it, is really at that same crossroads as well. Really, all of these superpowers are.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is now in a place where we can segue over to the United States, is really in a place where we decide whether we want to continue globalizing our economy, whether we want to continue that. But at the same mindset as the Chinese, really it's not necessarily capitalist versus communist in this mindset. What we're seeing is competing ideology.
Yeah.
Whether the United States wants to continue along this track with the abundance of geographical resources, the abundance of geographical mass that we have, the purely a divine blessing from God, our creator, that we have the system that we do in the United States, whether we want to continue evolving with other nations. I think really what I think is we don't need globalism anymore. We've gotten to the point where we are too competitive.
It's not a matter of we want
It's
globalism.
yeah.
Globalism cannot survive what's coming.
Yeah.
Half the world's population is about to die off.
What we're
Globalism is dependent upon consumerism, which is dependent upon population growth.
yeah.
We have no more population growth. We're going to be the only people left who can survive this, which means make America great again. We're about to come back as an empire.
I think what we're seeing here is the dying stage before the end of globalism.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, let's think of it as running a relay. There's a point at which if you have 3 runners who are always tying, each lap, every lap, they're continuously going around together, Russia, China, and the United States.
Yeah.
There's going to come a point at which those 3 runners are not necessarily going to give up, because they're very competitive people. The United States, our competition comes through our idea of individualism.
Yeah. American exceptionalism.
The Chinese comes from the progress, the competition with other states going back to the dynasties. And the fundamentalism of Russia of wanting to have a stake where they are in their hemisphere. Really, those 3 ideas, you're going to see these 3 people can't win the race. They can't let back either. These people aren't going to stop running at the same pace. I think what we're going to see is the competition is not necessarily going to die off.
Oh, no, it will die off.
But what we're going to see is I think we're tired of competing. We're tired of trying to get ahead and ahead and ahead, and we're continuously giving up the American culture. We're giving up the American dream, outsourcing our labor. We're outsourcing the labor that was once held. You look at great cities like Detroit, what it used to be. We used to have the lowest unemployment for every minority, for the lowest crime rate in the world. We used to have the highest church attendance rate. All of these things play into the American way of life. And you look at the expanse that globalism has taken on the United States. We're at an age where there's just so much going on that everybody's at the crossroads of whether we want to sit back and become ourselves again.
Trump marked the age where America is starting to step back from the rest of the world. We have
Yeah.
the resources, the population, and the attitude to not care, and we don't need to care.
We don't need to be in everybody's business.
And our population will die off. Look at the demographics. They're not going to exist.
Yeah.
Even Western Europe is going to die off. Germany's gone. Japan is gone. Britain is going to hang in there. Britain and Ireland are probably going to run to us and be in our corner. Canada and Mexico will stay with us, and what's left of Japan maybe, but most of the world is about to die off.
Yeah.
America, look at the Mississippi alone. That is just a beautiful river system for creating and transporting capital all over the first half of the country.
It's somewhere about 90% of the rivers in this country flow into the tributary of the Mississippi River.
That's great for us. Look at the resources we have. The coal we have, Brian, China has this brown, ugly coal that doesn't really burn that well.
Yeah.
You want to Google that real quick? Because we have like this great black coal all over Appalachia. Perfect. We have lots of natural gas. We have lots of uranium as well. Wonderful. The rail system. We don't have the permafrost issue Russia has, so our rail system can span the entire continent and be fine.
Yeah. There's a few things that I want to touch on here.
Yeah.
And I really have to have a physical map of the United States to get this across. We really have a system like no other. And a lot of people our age, a lot of people in the world today don't think enough about how blessed we are as a country to have the geography that we do. We are the only superpower in the world that touches 2 oceans, that has access to 2 oceans, has the broadest reaching territories of any nation on earth.
Yeah.
We have nations like the Philippines that were under us at some point. They're right on the back door of China.
There's 2 parts to that oceans thing. We're an island essentially.
Yeah.
So when Europe decides to blow up and be dramatic, we don't have to jump in. I have no idea why we jumped in the last 2 times.
Yeah.
We should have stayed out. We have the option to stay out of this third upcoming one
We-
from the looks of it. I say we stay out.
We are the only nation that has access to 2 oceans
Yeah.
and a Gulf.
Oh, yeah.
We have the industry for fishing. We have the industry for exporting. We have the means to be the world's maritime superpower.
There's something else here, too.
But they're not locked up by ice most of the year
Yeah.
either.
There's only 2 sovereign nations in the world, meaning we can feed ourselves and call ourselves a nation at the same time. That's us and
Yeah.
Russia. Russia is completely cut off from the rest of the world because of the port situation, and they have a declining population. We can feed ourselves. The Gulf is our playground,
Yeah.
and we have the full Atlantic and the full Pacific. This is great.
We look at the geographical regions of this country too, and I'm gonna kind of touch on the importance of Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike. Remember those names, and we might just carry this over to Thursday
Yeah.
because it's a lot of stuff. The United States has advantages that no other country on earth has. We have the Great Plains that provide the breadbasket of the world before Ukraine ever got to become the media attended country that they are. The United States essentially was the breadbasket of the Western Hemisphere.
I say we go back to that.
We have the means, the productive output, the manpower to grow the most crops, to sustain ourselves, and to give all that we can to exports and make all this money.
I say screw that. I think we need to go back to being completely our own isolation.
Self-sustained.
Yeah, like just I'd say make American, buy American, sell American. That's it. Like I get away from the rest of the world. It's getting crazy out there. Maybe we do deals with Canada, Mexico, and the UK and Ireland, but that's it.
Yeah. So we look at the Great Plains. The Great Plains are really the only plains in the world that are either not on a step or an elevation that is so much more different from the last. You think about steps. The steps in China are this
Central Asia, right?
very jagged.
Yeah.
It's almost like they grow on top of these big cliffs, and it's good for rice farming, but they don't have the level land to grow corn, to grow wheat, to grow crops like we do. Russia, the majority of that land that they have is permafrost or frosted over most of the year.
You could probably buy it real cheap, but you can't do anything on it.
I would say one of the biggest blessings that this country ever had was manifest destiny. The desire to move west is what gave us the Great Plains. It was what opened the door to the Rocky Mountains so that we could find out that we have more than one river basin in this country. The Hoover Dam provides, I believe, half the power for the homes within the central Rocky Mountain area. Half the power is created by the Colorado River system.
When the Chinese try to make a dam, it floods the whole damn country.
So
we don't have that issue. Look at the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
The
trade with Canada,
we have everything
openness.
we need here. There's no reason we need to be playing this globalist game. We never should have outsourced our jobs. I blame Nixon for that. We can just stay here. We are our own island. And Mexico and Canada, perfect. We just need to get that southern border under control.
I put the blame, the one gentleman who recently died, I put the blame on Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
Henry Kissinger was a traitor to this country, was a traitor to this republic. When we look at the way that Nixon is put at fault for opening China, you start to look the ideas that this came from Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was the brainchild of opening up to China. Henry Kissinger worked with Jimmy Carter after Nixon got out of office. He worked with all these different presidents and still did, I believe, up until the Obama administration. Henry Kissinger's idea revolved around wanting to export more to China, send our jobs over there, send all the banks, send the finance.
He was a trader who sold us out.
Yeah, and all this did was get rid of working class conditions that bettered minorities in inner city communities in places like Detroit. You saw automotive industry, you saw farming shut down in this country, you saw clothes that we grew in the South. The South.
You're referring to cotton, right?
Yeah, the cotton that we grew in the South, we exported 500 million bales a year to Great Britain at the peak of the Confederate States. Given that, I'm not going to touch on the Civil War or my opinions on that. We had the resources at some point. And then when the South was forced to develop like the rest of the North, it was really forced on the South. We were forced into an industry that, frankly, all these factories take up the room that we once could have farmed. We had the perfect condition for cotton. We had the perfect condition for all these crops, these staple crops that we could still export and still have dependency on ourselves. Now you can't look at a shirt at Walmart without saying made in China. And I look at the great
when
industry that we
China
once had.
collapses, we'll be missing shirts and underwear.
Yeah. And we wouldn't be. We wouldn't be if this country managed its resources the way that it should. If our politicians didn't continuously tell us you can't do this, you can't do that because of environmental regulations. The American nation, I think we're going to see a rebirth here when globalism has had its day in the sun.
At the late 2020s, when demographics and debt bombs get China, then
Yeah.
Russia, you're going to see the rest of the world turn to chaos. Because
Yeah.
the rest of the world is very much dependent upon the big three, especially us.
Yeah.
But America, we are our own island.
Yeah.
We'll stick with Canada and Mexico. We don't really have a choice there. We'll probably stick with, Britain and Ireland because they're our closest kin, if you would. Maybe Australia as well for the same reason.
And that
We're going to do our own thing, though. And we should have been doing our own thing this entire time. We should not have been playing world police. This is why our economy is suffering so much. We're overextended from playing world police.
And we look at Sean brings up a good point. There's something called Tobler's law in geography. The first law is something closer to something else is always going to have more in common than two things that are very far apart. You look at China and you look at Mexico. What do we have more in common with? It's going to be Mexico. Because we continuously interact with somebody that's closer.
There's something about Mexico, too. They don't have the demographic issues that China has, but
Yeah.
they do have cheap labor. I mean, they're going to be the cheap labor capital of the world. They're in our backyard. They're our friend. Let's keep it that way.
Yeah.
You will see North America come back with a vengeance at the end of the 2020s. We're in like this weird revolutionary transfer period right now. We are looking at a golden age ahead.
So stick with us. We're going to be back with another hard-hitting topic on Thursday. Thank you for sticking with us. God bless you. God bless the United States of America. And may the blood of Christ run over this government. We desperately need it.
From Burleson to Venus and Grandview to Godley, this is the voice of Johnson County. Joco Community Radio.